Some abbreviations that you'll see are NEC. This means not elsewhere classified. So this is directing the coder to use the other specified code in the tabular that usually includes the 8 as a character. Not otherwise specified appears in both the alphabetic and the tabular. It's the same thing as unspecified, which is always represented with the number 9 as the character. So this is used when the documentation of the conditions identified by the provider does not contain enough information to assign a more specific code. Square brackets are used to enclose synonyms, alternative wording, or explanatory phrases. These are used for informational purposes only. Anything that falls in the square brackets is not required to be part of the diagnostic statement to use the code. It doesn't change the code selection. Slanted brackets are a little bit different. Slanted brackets are used to indicate the manifestation codes. The manifestations are the secondary condition that's present in addition to the underlying disease that caused the manifestation. 2 codes are required when the patient has both the underlying disease and the secondary condition. The use of the slanted bracket provides sequencing direction. So the code that appears in the bracket is listed as the secondary code and follows the disease code directly after the diagnostic term in the index. Parentheses are what we call the non-essential modifiers, which we talked about earlier. These are additional text, words that may or may not be present that don't affect the code selection. The colon used in the tabular after an incomplete term means that we need 1 or more additional terms in order to be assigned to that particular code. The colon is used with includes and excludes notes, which would precede the colon and are not considered complete terms. In terms of other and unspecified codes, the codes are driven by the documentation that's in the health record, right? So the alphabetic index with not elsewhere classified designates other codes. In other words, it's specific. There's just not a code that matches up with that. This is a bit different than unspecified, right? Unspecified means that the documentation that the provider put in the health record is insufficient to assign a more specific code. So they give an example: asthma, J45.909 versus mild intermittent asthma of J45.20. There are a lot of instructional notes in the tabular that provide directions for the coder. They appear in the beginning of the chapters. They introduce the content of the chapter, and they give us directions about how to apply these codes. Inclusion lists are a list of diagnoses that fall under some codes in the tabular. These terms are synonymous with the code title. Inclusion terms are not an exhaustive list, but the additional terms found only in the alphabetic index are also assigned to that code. Includes is going to include other terms that will map us to that 3-character code title. Excludes means that we can't have codes with this. They're independent of each other. And there are 2 types: excludes 1 and excludes 2. Excludes 1 means that the code can't be used at the same time as the code from the excludes 1. It's mutually exclusive. You can't have both conditions at the same time. So in other words, an example that would be a chronic versus acute, unless otherwise specified, or congenital versus acquired. So in other words, the excludes 1 is telling the coder that you need to pick one or the other based on the documentation. Excludes two means that two codes are applied when both conditions are present and documented. So the patient may have both conditions at the same time, and one code doesn't include both conditions, so two codes are applied based on the documentation. Some codes and diseases produce other diseases or manifestations. So ICD-10 will require these two codes, and these are as follows. The disease that's considered the etiology is coded first. The second code, which is the manifestation or results from the first code, is listed as an additional code. Code first is telling us which one will be coded, right? So if something follows the code first and it's italicized and includes the phrase "in diseases classified elsewhere," these are always additional codes. In other words, we follow the tabular and code first, we select that to be the first listed code. Use additional code means that there are diseases that need two codes to fully describe what's going on. And the code books and the tabular will remind you to use additional code to fully describe the condition. Anything that's listed as a use additional code is always going to be additional. In other words, it will never be coded first. There's some etiology and manifestation conventions in the alphabetic index. So if both conditions are listed on the first line with the etiology code listed first, and the manifestation codes appear in slanted brackets after it, the slanted brackets code will always be the second code. The tabular is telling us that the coder must read at the level or at the code level to code first a certain condition, or to use the additional code as following the code that appears with it. We have an example here with Alzheimer's disease or dementia, right? So the main term is disease, the subterm is Alzheimer's, and that leads us to G30.0. We would then follow with the dementia of F02.80, dementia and other diseases classified elsewhere without behavioral disturbances. That's all I have for you. We will continue on our journey with coding in the next video lecture.